When a fourth-generation farmer discovers a critically injured eagle with unusual silver markings in his withering cornfield, he never imagines it would transform his life overnight. As he works to save the magnificent bird, its extraordinary resilience begins healing, not just his struggling farm, but every creature it encounters. But when government wildlife experts in unmarked vehicles descend on his property before dawn, the shocking revelation doesn't just salvage his family's endangered legacy. It revolutionizes our understanding of avian intelligence and America's classified conservation programs that have operated in shadows for decades. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Deep in the heart of Idaho's Teton Valley, where generations of farmers had cultivated the rich soil against the backdrop of the majestic mountain range, Jackson Caldwell stood frozen at the edge of his drought-stricken cornfield, staring at something that defied explanation. The devastating drought that had plagued the region for 19 months had driven him to check his far fields for any salvageable crops. But what he discovered would challenge everything he thought he knew about wildlife, government conservation efforts, and the hidden potential of his family's seemingly doomed farm. The eagle before him was unlike any he'd ever encountered in his 40 years living in this valley. Its feathers held distinctive silver patterns that appeared to shift in the afternoon light, displaying markings that pulsed with an almost luminescent quality. This wasn't just another golden eagle that had been injured during hunting. This was something entirely different. The bird's wing was clearly broken, yet it regarded Jackson with an intelligence that made his breath catch. Its eyes displayed an awareness that seemed almost human, studying him with unmistakable calculation rather than fear. The day had started like any other at Caldwell Heritage Farm. Jackson had risen before dawn, troubled by the increasingly dire situation facing his family's once prosperous operation. The drought had devastated their corn and wheat fields, forcing them to sell livestock they could no longer afford to feed. The irrigation costs had skyrocketed while crop yields plummeted, and 3 separate equipment breakdowns had drained their emergency funds. Jackson's mind wandered to the final notice from Agribank that sat unopened on his kitchen counter. He knew what it contained: another warning about their overdue loan payments and a deadline that loomed just 30 days away. The farm that his great-grandfather had established in 1937 during the Dust Bowl, determined to create sustainable agriculture in the face of natural disaster, was slipping through his fingers despite everything he'd sacrificed to save it. The farm's reputation had once made it a cornerstone of the community. Their innovative dryland farming techniques had drawn agricultural students from the state university, and their corn had won regional awards for both quality and sustainability. But now, with their wells running dry and creditors calling daily, they could barely keep the lights on. Elaine, Jackson's wife, and the farm's resident irrigation specialist had been working evening shifts at the local veterinary clinic to help make ends meet. Their daughter Maya, who had inherited her mother's tenacity and her father's love for the land, had deferred her college acceptance to stay and fight for the farm's survival. The weight of their sacrifices pressed heavily on Jackson's shoulders as he made his morning rounds. That's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong in these failing fields. It was a strange, almost musical trilling that mixed with the afternoon breeze. Following the sound, he'd crossed the dry irrigation ditch that separated the cornfield from the unplanted acreage near the property line. The noise grew stronger, accompanied by what seemed like a faint metallic gleam in the harsh sunlight. As Jackson approached, he noticed something else unusual. The soil in this section of the field was somehow different, darker, almost moist, despite the drought that had turned the rest of his land to dust. The air felt charged with an energy he couldn't explain, reminiscent of the atmosphere just before a lightning storm broke across the valley. The injured eagle stood, or rather perched awkwardly, in the center of this inexplicably different patch of earth. Its feathers contained colors he'd never seen on any bird of prey, yet none that he could definitively identify as unnatural. The patterns that moved across its plumage reminded him of the northern lights he'd seen on a fishing trip to Montana years ago, fluid, ethereal, and somehow alive. Despite a clearly broken wing that hung at an unnatural angle, the eagle carried itself with remarkable dignity. What captured Jackson's attention most were the bird's eyes. In 4 decades of encountering wildlife on his property, he'd learned to recognize animal intelligence and intent. But these eyes held something he'd never witnessed before, an awareness that seemed to transcend normal animal consciousness, studying him with equal curiosity. Drawing on years of experience helping injured wildlife, a common enough occurrence on a working farm, Jackson began to slowly approach, speaking in low, soothing tones. The eagle made no move to escape, instead adjusting its position to better observe him. As he got closer, Jackson could see that the wing injury should have been causing significant distress, yet the bird showed few signs of pain. Even more surprising, he could have sworn he saw traces of that same ethereal silver light moving beneath the feathers, concentrating around the wounded wing. As the sun slipped lower toward the Teton range, Jackson faced a decision that would change not just his life, but potentially our understanding of wildlife conservation forever. Should he call the local wildlife rehabilitation center immediately, knowing that bringing outsiders in might lead to losing control of this extraordinary creature? Or should he first try to understand what he was dealing with, aware that such a choice could either doom or save everything he'd worked to protect? Jackson Caldwell's connection to this particular piece of Idaho ran as deep as the aquifer that once nourished its crops. For 4 generations, the Caldwells had worked this challenging terrain, transforming a homestead claim into one of Teton Valley's most respected family farms. Their 320-acre property, nestled against the foothills with a stunning view of the Grand Tetons, had been a model for sustainable agriculture since his grandfather implemented innovative soil conservation techniques during the 1950s. But lately, that proud legacy was crumbling like the dry earth between his fingers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At 47, Jackson's weathered face and the perpetual soil ingrained in the creases of his hands told the story of someone who had chosen to follow family tradition rather than pursue other opportunities. 12 years ago, he had walked away from a promising career as a wildlife biologist with the Department of Interior, trading research expeditions and policy meetings for pre-dawn mornings behind the wheel of a tractor. The transformation of Jackson Caldwell, MS Wildlife Management, into just plain Jackson, the struggling farmer, wasn't part of his original plan. Growing up, he'd loved the farm, but dreamed of protecting the greater ecosystem it existed within. His father, Richard Caldwell, had supported his academic pursuits, proud to have a scientist in the family. "Understanding the land makes you a better steward," he'd always said, encouraging Jackson to pursue his studies while keeping his connection to Caldwell heritage alive. Just 8 years ago, the farm had been thriving. His father's innovative water conservation systems had helped them weather the beginning of the drought better than most neighboring operations. Their sustainable practices had earned them features in agricultural magazines and visiting spots on regional farm tours. Graduate students would visit to learn about their water-efficient irrigation techniques, and the farm's income had been enough to support both Jackson's family and his parents comfortably. But then, everything changed. His father's sudden stroke had forced Jackson to leave his government position and take over the farm operations. The transition had been brutal. Despite his scientific background, managing a working farm required a different set of skills than conducting field research or writing policy briefs. The learning curve had been steep, and expensive mistakes were made in those early months. Then the real troubles began. The drought had intensified beyond anything the region had experienced in recorded history. The snowpack that fed their water rights had diminished year after year. The wells began to run dry, despite being drilled deeper at considerable expense. Jackson had watched helplessly as their crop yields dwindled while operating costs soared. He'd employed every bit of his scientific training to analyze the problem, running tests on soil samples, researching drought-resistant crop varieties, and implementing every water conservation technique he could find. But nothing seemed enough to overcome the relentless arithmetic of declining rainfall and increasing temperatures. He'd been forced to lay off the seasonal workers who had been with the family for years. The decision had torn at his heart, but with loan payments looming and equipment repairs eating into their reserves, he'd had no choice. Now it was just him, Elaine, Maya, and old Luther Williams, who'd worked as their mechanic for 30 years and refused to abandon the farm, despite Jackson's inability to pay him full wages. The local community had watched Caldwell heritage's decline with growing concern. The Caldwell name meant something in Teton Valley. His grandfather had helped establish the region's first soil and water conservation district, and his father had served on the state's agricultural advisory board. Their farm had always been a cornerstone of local food security, providing grain for regional bakeries and dairy operations throughout Idaho and Wyoming. Last week, Margaret Denton, the regional loan officer who handled their farm credit, had called Jackson in for a meeting. The conversation still echoed in his mind. "Jackson, you've got until the end of the quarter to get current on your payments. I pushed this as far as I can with the loan committee, but if something doesn't change..." The unfinished sentence had hung in the air like the dust that now shrouded his fields. 30 more days. That's all he had to save 4 generations of Caldwell history. Jackson had tried everything he could think of. He'd applied for emergency agricultural subsidies, consulted with university extension programs, and even considered converting part of their acreage to solar farming in hopes of generating alternative income. But each potential solution required capital he didn't have, and the bank's deadline loomed ever closer. His father's medical bills had helped drain their financial reserves, and now the farm equipment was breaking down more frequently as they deferred essential maintenance. The appearance of the strange eagle couldn't have come at a more critical time. Their remaining livestock seemed stressed, showing signs of the same desperation that Jackson felt every morning when he looked at the weather forecast and saw no rain in sight. The farm's beloved border collie, Scout, had been listless for weeks, sensing the family's mounting anxiety. That's what should have been going through his mind as he stood in that strange patch of earth, watching the silver patterns play across the eagle's feathers. But something deeper, perhaps the same intuition that had made his family such successful farmers for generations, told him this was different. Though he didn't yet understand what he was looking at or what it might mean, his scientific training combined with generations of farmers' instinct told him that this discovery could change everything. As the eagle's unusual markings continued to shift and flow in the afternoon light, Jackson's mind raced with possibilities. Could this mysterious bird be connected to the wildlife research he'd abandoned years ago, or would trying to help it be the final mistake that ended his family's agricultural legacy? The eagle's intelligent eyes seemed to study him as if it understood his dilemma, its presence radiating a calm that somehow made the weight of his decisions feel lighter. As the injured eagle continued to regard him steadily, Jackson's wildlife biology training kicked in, overriding his initial amazement. He reached slowly for his phone, not to call for help, but to document what he was seeing. Years of scientific observation had taught him the importance of evidence, and whatever this bird was, it deserved proper documentation. His hands trembled slightly as he activated his phone's camera, but the eagle showed no sign of distress at the device's presence. If anything, it seemed to respond with increased interest, its mysterious silver patterns shifting more rapidly as he approached. Jackson began recording, falling naturally into the familiar cadence of scientific observation. Subject appears to be an adult golden eagle, approximately 30 inches in height, he whispered, maintaining a calm, professional tone despite his racing heart. Wingspan would likely exceed 6 feet if extended. Plumage displays unprecedented color-changing abilities, with fluid patterns reminiscent of bioluminescence. The specimen demonstrates what appears to be conscious control over these markings, suggesting unprecedented neural control over feather appearance. Most remarkably, despite a severe fracture to the left wing, the bird shows minimal signs of distress. As he recorded, Jackson noticed something extraordinary. The eagle's feather patterns weren't random. They seemed to form complex geometric shapes that reminded him of the Native American petroglyphs he'd studied during his university days. The patterns were dynamic, shifting and flowing with a purpose he couldn't yet comprehend. Most intriguing was the eagle's apparent interest in its surroundings. While any normal injured raptor would be displaying clear signs of fear and defensive posturing, this one moved with deliberate purpose, its attention particularly focused on the struggling cornstalks beyond the mysterious patch where it rested. Jackson's attention was drawn to the wing injury itself, a clean break that should have been causing significant pain and distress. But as he watched, something impossible seemed to be happening. The same ethereal patterns that moved across. The eagle's feathers appeared to concentrate around the wound, creating a subtle luminescence that pulsed in rhythm with what he assumed was the bird's heartbeat. What happened next made Jackson nearly drop his phone. The eagle extended its injured wings slightly, and where the tips of its primary feathers touched the ground, the soil began to change color. The effect spread outward in a circular pattern, turning pale, dusty earth to rich, dark soil, as if life itself was flowing from the bird into the drought-stricken ground. "This is impossible," Jackson muttered, moving closer to observe. His scientific mind raced to make sense of what he was seeing. Was this some form of rapid soil enrichment? A biological interaction unlike anything previously documented? He needed more equipment, more ways to measure and record what was happening. Making a quick decision, Jackson hurried to his truck, where he kept his old field research kit. He returned with a soil testing kit, his old research journal, and various diagnostic tools he'd held onto from his government work. The eagle remained in place, seeming to watch his preparations with intelligent interest. Soil analysis showed readings that should have been impossible, organic matter and microorganism levels that would take years to develop naturally, were suddenly present in soil that had been barren just minutes earlier. What stunned Jackson was the moisture reading of the revived soil. It showed hydration levels that defied the drought conditions. Somehow this eagle wasn't just making the soil look healthier, it was actually transforming its fundamental properties. As he documented these observations, Jackson's mind wandered to the implications. If this bird could interact with soil in such a way, what did that mean for ecological science? More immediately, could this explain how a small patch in his otherwise devastated field seemed to be defying the drought? The eagle suddenly raised its head, eyes fixed intently toward the farmhouse in the distance. Jackson checked his watch and realized he'd been observing the creature for over 3 hours. Elaine would be returning soon from her shift at the vet clinic, and he needed to make a decision about how to proceed. His scientific background told him he should contact his old colleagues at the Department of Interior immediately. This discovery could revolutionize their understanding of avian biology and ecological restoration. The eagle's apparent ability to influence soil quality alone could have massive implications for drought mitigation and land reclamation. But another part of him, the part that had watched his father nurse injured wildlife back to health throughout his childhood, urged caution. This eagle had chosen his farm, his field for some reason. It seemed to be helping, not harming, and there was something about its intelligent gaze that suggested it had purpose in its actions. Looking at his phone, Jackson saw 3 missed calls from Elaine. His wife would be starting dinner soon, and he needed to decide whether to share this discovery with her. Elaine was not only his partner, but also had veterinary technician training. Her understanding of injured wildlife had often proven more valuable than his academic knowledge. The eagle made the decision for him. As the sound of Elaine's car approached, in the distance, it moved deliberately toward a cluster of tall corn stalks at the field's edge. Its feather patterns shifted to match the golden brown of the dying corn, maintaining its mysterious presence while becoming almost invisible to casual observation. Jackson quickly gathered his equipment, mind already formulating a research plan, drawing on his scientific training to create a framework for studying this unprecedented situation. Moving some broken stalks to better conceal the eagle's location, he spoke softly to it. "I don't know what you are, but I'm going to protect you. I need time to understand what's happening here." The eagle's patterns shifted in response, creating a ripple of silver light that seemed almost like a nod of acknowledgement. As he heard Elaine's car pulling up to the farmhouse, Jackson took one last look at his extraordinary discovery. In just a few hours, his world had shifted on its axis. The farm that had been a symbol of his failing legacy now housed what might be the most significant wildlife discovery in his lifetime. The question was, could he handle this responsibility alone, or would trying to keep this secret prove to be his biggest mistake? The next 48 hours became an intricate dance of secrecy and scientific observation. Each morning and evening, Jackson would make his way to the hidden corner of the cornfield, his heart racing as he approached the site, half afraid he'd find the mysterious eagle gone or discovered by someone else. But each time it remained, continuing its inexplicable work with the surrounding environment in ways that both fascinated and baffled him. His old research skills came flooding back as he established a makeshift field laboratory in the cab of his truck. He'd retrieved more sophisticated testing equipment from storage, along with other tools he'd kept from his wildlife biology days. The eagle seemed to accept his presence and his instruments, sometimes even appearing to pose for his camera or adjust its position when he was taking measurements. Most remarkably, it showed signs that its wing was healing at an accelerated rate, the fracture already beginning to stabilize in a way that should have taken weeks rather than days. The most extraordinary development came on the second day, when Jackson checked on the patch of soil where the eagle had first appeared. The transformation was remarkable. Not only had the soil structure fully regenerated, but the corn stalks, within a 15-foot radius, were showing signs of recovery. The withered plants had begun to strengthen, their leaves greening, their stalks straightening in defiance of the drought. Field observation, day 2, Jackson spoke into his digital recorder while examining a soil sample under his portable microscope. The soil contains unprecedented levels of microorganisms and nutrients. Nitrogen fixation appears to be occurring at 3 times normal rates. There's some kind of biological enhancement happening that defies everything we know about soil remediation. What fascinated Jackson most was the eagle's apparent intelligence and purpose. It wasn't randomly affecting the landscape. It seemed to be systematically working through the most damaged sections of the field, spending more time near the weakest plants. The soft, trilling sounds it produced appeared to change with different activities, almost like a form of communication with different tones for different tasks. Keeping the secret from Elaine proved more challenging than he'd anticipated. His wife of 22 years had worked alongside him too long not to notice the sudden changes in his behavior and the unexpected vitality in that corner of their cornfield. "Never seen anything like it," she'd commented that morning, checking the soil in what had been their driest field. "It's like the land found some kind of miracle cure." Jackson had mumbled something about testing a new organic amendment, but he could tell Elaine wasn't entirely convinced. Her face had creased with concern as she studied the recovering corn, particularly when a mysterious trilling sound had echoed across the field. The implications of the eagle's presence were already becoming apparent. In just 2 days, patches of their drought-stricken land had begun to recover. Even more remarkably, Scout, their border collie, who had been listless for weeks, had suddenly perked up after drinking from a puddle that had inexplicably formed near where the eagle had spent the night. But it was on the evening of the second day that Jackson made a discovery that truly shook his understanding of what he was dealing with. He'd been reviewing footage from the small trail camera he'd hidden in the cornstalks when he noticed something extraordinary. Late at night, when the area was empty except for the mysterious eagle, its feather patterns would create complex geometric displays that seemed to pulse with their own light. These weren't random patterns. They resembled the petroglyphs he'd studied years ago during his work with the Bureau of Land Management, documenting ancient Native American sites throughout Idaho. "These aren't random markings," Jackson muttered, watching the footage for the third time. The designs resembled star charts, watershed maps, and what looked like migration routes. The eagle wasn't just communicating, it was trying to share information. Jackson began mapping the patterns, drawing on his scientific training to identify recurring symbols and sequences. He found himself wishing he'd paid more attention during his cultural resource management training. He had a growing suspicion that he was looking at something far more extraordinary than an unusual eagle mutation or undocumented species. The pressure of maintaining his secret was starting to wear on him. That afternoon, he'd had to turn away. A local wildlife conservation officer who had shown unexpected interest in the recovering section of their cornfield. The county agricultural extension office had called twice, curious about reports of drought-resistant corn appearing on his property. Each inquiry required careful deflection, and Jackson found himself constructing an increasingly complex web of half-truths. His isolation was taking its toll. There were so many questions he needed to discuss with other researchers, so many tests he couldn't perform with his limited field equipment. The eagle's apparent ability to accelerate soil regeneration and plant growth could have massive implications for drought mitigation, sustainable agriculture, and wildlife conservation. But every time he considered reaching out to his old colleagues, he remembered how the scientific community typically responded to unusual discoveries, with immediate quarantine, endless tests, and little regard for the creature's agency or apparent intelligence. Late on the second night, Jackson sat in his truck, watching the eagle work with another section of damaged cornfield. Its feather patterns had taken on a gentle, almost therapeutic quality as it moved between the struggling plants. The sight reminded him of his father, how he'd always said that the key to farming was understanding and working with nature, not trying to control it. "I wish you could tell me exactly what you are," he said softly to the eagle. To his amazement, it turned toward him and began creating a new pattern of shifting silver lights, more intricate than any he'd seen before. The display showed what looked like a map of mountain ranges, with strange markings at specific points along the ridgelines. One of those points seemed to correspond exactly with the location of Caldwell Heritage Farm. Jackson's hand shook as he sketched the pattern in his notebook. This wasn't random, this was deliberate communication. The eagle wasn't just some unique mutation. It appeared to be part of something larger, something planned. But before he could process the implications of this revelation, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel nearby. His heart stopped as he recognized the sound of Elaine's SUV. She wasn't supposed to be back from her evening shift at the vet clinic for another hour. The eagle's patterns dimmed slightly, but didn't disappear completely, and Jackson could hear footsteps approaching through the corn. He had seconds to decide. Try to hide everything, or finally let someone else in on his extraordinary secret. Elaine's footsteps drew closer through the tall stalks, and Jackson's heart hammered in his chest as his wife's familiar silhouette appeared in the twilight. The eagle's shifting patterns cast an ethereal glow across the field, illuminating Elaine's face as she stopped abruptly, her eyes widening at the impossible sight before her. There was no time to hide it, no way to explain away the extraordinary scene unfolding in their back field. "Jack," Elaine whispered, her composure momentarily shaken. Her hand reached out to steady herself against a cornstalk as she took in the mysterious eagle, its feathers rippling with colors that shouldn't exist in nature. "What in God's name have you been hiding out here?" The eagle, rather than retreating, seemed to study Elaine with intense interest. Its color patterns shifted to a softer, almost welcoming display, and it released one of its musical trilling sounds, a tone that made Elaine gasp. To Jackson's surprise, his wife didn't run or shout. Instead, she slowly approached, her 20 years of experience with injured animals evident in her careful movements. "This is why the cornfield is recovering," she said softly, her trained eye taking in every detail. "I knew something wasn't right about that organic amendment story. Been married to you too long to miss when you're hiding something." She turned to Jackson, her expression a mix of wonder and concern. "How long?" Jackson felt a wave of relief wash over him. Perhaps sharing this burden wouldn't be the disaster he'd feared. "Almost 3 days," he answered, watching as the eagle created another complex pattern of shifting silver lights on its wing feathers. "It's been healing the land, Elaine, not just healing it, enhancing it. The soil, the corn, everything it touches becomes better than it was before." Over the next hour, Jackson showed Elaine everything he'd documented. The eagle's regenerative abilities, the mysterious patterns, the transformed soil. His wife absorbed it all with remarkable calm, asking surprisingly insightful questions that made Jackson realize how much her veterinary work had taught her about animal biology and healing. "Your father always said nature had more healing power than we understood," Elaine mused, watching the eagle interact with another patch of damaged corn. "Guess he never figured something like this would show up in our own backyard." She paused, then added, "But Jack, we've got bigger problems than keeping this secret." Elaine explained that word was starting to spread about their farm's mysterious recovery. The feed supplier had commented on their improved corn. The bank had called, curious about the sudden change in their crop projections. Even their daughter Maya had noticed something different about the cornfield and had been asking questions Elaine couldn't answer. "And that's not all," Elaine continued, pulling out her phone. "Look at this." She showed him a local farming forum where people were discussing Caldwell Heritage Farm's mysterious transformation. Someone had posted drone photos of their fields, capturing the distinct circular pattern of recovery that radiated from where the eagle had first appeared. The thread was filled with speculation about secret government experiments and new agricultural technologies. Jackson's stomach churned as he scrolled through the comments. Their secret was already slipping away, one curious observation at a time. The eagle, seeming to sense their distress, moved closer and created a series of calming patterns that rippled through the air between them. "We need a plan," Elaine said firmly. Can't keep this under wraps much longer, and we need to protect both the farm and, she gestured at the eagle, our friend here, whatever it is. It chose us for a reason. As if in response to Elaine's words, the eagle began creating its most complex display yet. The patterns on its feathers shifted to show what appeared to be mountain ranges, valleys, and what looked like ancient migration routes. Jackson gasped as he recognized landmarks from the surrounding Teton range. It's trying to tell us something, Jackson breathed, quickly sketching the patterns in his notebook. These locations, they're all connected to the old wildlife corridors we mapped during my BLM days. But why show us now? Their discussion was interrupted by the sound of multiple vehicles approaching the farm. Jackson's heart sank as he recognized Maya's voice calling from near the house, along with what sounded like several others. The old barn cellar, Elaine said quickly, already moving to guide the eagle. Take him through the back rows to the storm cellar behind the old barn. I'll handle whoever's coming. Her experience managing crisis situations with injured wildlife was evident in her calm efficiency. As Jackson led the eagle towards safety, he could hear Elaine's voice carrying across the yard, spinning a tale about testing drought-resistant corn varieties provided by the University Extension Office. See, Eagle moved with him willingly, its patterns dimmed to near invisibility as they made their way through the darkening fields. But Jackson noticed it was creating a new sequence of colors as they walked, one that seemed to pulse with urgency. In the relative safety of the old storm cellar, Jackson studied the eagle's latest display. The pattern showed a clear progression. More points of light appearing along the mountain ranges, spreading through valleys, connecting in a complex network. With sudden clarity, he realized what he was seeing. This wasn't just about their farm. This was the beginning of something much larger. His phone buzzed with a text from Margaret Denton at the bank. Jackson, we need to talk about the extraordinary changes at Caldwell Heritage. I'm coming out first thing tomorrow morning. This kind of turnaround requires explanation. Above ground, he could hear more vehicles arriving. Elaine's voice was joined by others, curious neighbors, local farmers, all drawn by the rumors of Caldwell Heritage Farm's mysterious transformation. The eagle's patterns pulsed in a sequence that seemed almost apologetic, but its continued communications suggested it had no intention of leaving. Jackson realized they were reaching a tipping point. The secret was unraveling faster than they could control, and decisions would soon be forced upon them if they didn't act first. As he stood in the old storm cellar with this extraordinary being, watching its colors dance across the earthen walls, he knew the time for hiding was coming to an end. What he didn't know was that events were already in motion that would transform their private discovery into a revelation that would shake the foundations of wildlife conservation and change our understanding of interspecies communication forever. The unmistakable sound of government vehicles, the low, powerful hum of heavy-duty engines, broke the pre-dawn silence. Jackson, who had spent the night in the storm cellar monitoring the eagle, felt his heart sink as headlights swept across the farm's entrance road. Through the small cellar window, he counted 3 black SUVs with government plates, followed by what appeared to be specialized equipment trucks. Unmarked vehicles, arriving before sunrise. This was exactly the scenario he had feared. Jackson's phone vibrated with a text from Elaine. They're here. Multiple agencies. Someone must have talked. Coming to you now. The eagle, which had been creating increasingly complex patterns throughout the night, suddenly intensified its displays. The silver markings coalesced into what appeared to be a warning, a pattern that pulsed with unmistakable urgency. Jackson faced the most critical decision of his life. Would he surrender the extraordinary creature to government authorities, or would he attempt to protect it, potentially breaking federal wildlife laws in the process? The crisis struck with stunning swiftness as dawn broke over Caldwell Heritage Farm. Jackson had just finished checking on the Eagle in the storm cellar when he spotted 4 black SUVs with government plates pulling up to the main gate. His stomach tightened as he recognized the insignia on one of them, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He quickly texted Elaine, "They're here. Official vehicles. Stay inside with Maya." Jackson took a deep breath, straightened his worn cap, and walked toward the approaching vehicles with the deliberate pace of a man defending his land. As the caravan came to a stop in the farmyard, doors opened simultaneously with practiced precision. Men and women in various uniforms emerged, some in the olive drab of Fish and Wildlife, others in tactical gear with no visible identification. "Mr. Caldwell," called out a silver-haired woman who stepped forward from the lead vehicle. "I'm Dr. Catherine Reynolds, Senior Wildlife Biologist with the Interior Department's Special Species Division. We need to speak with you about a matter of national significance." Before Jackson could respond, a familiar trilling sound echoed from the direction of the old barn. He watched in dismay as all activity in the yard ceased, everyone's attention drawn to the distinctive call. Dr. Reynolds' eyes widened, her hand immediately reaching for her radio. "Confirmation on site," she said quietly. "Implement Protocol Starlight immediately." "This is private property," Jackson called out, trying to maintain some control of the rapidly deteriorating situation. "I don't recall inviting a government convoy onto my land at dawn." Dr. Reynolds approached him directly, her expression a careful mixture of authority and conciliation. "Mr. Caldwell, I understand your concern, but what you've encountered is far more significant than you realize. That eagle, if we can even call it that, is part of a classified research program that dates back decades." From the corner of his eye, Jackson saw teams of technicians already unloading sophisticated equipment. Others were establishing a perimeter around the farm buildings with alarming efficiency. His phone buzzed, Elaine texting that more vehicles were arriving at their back entrance road. "You have exactly 1 minute to explain what's happening." "On my property before I call the sheriff," Jackson said, planting his feet firmly. Dr. Reynolds glanced at her watch. "You won't do that, Mr. Caldwell, because you've already witnessed what that creature can do. You're a former wildlife biologist with the Interior Department. You know this is beyond anything in standard scientific classification. And deep down, you want answers as badly as we do." The fact that she knew his background sent a chill through Jackson. How long had they been watching him? "That eagle found you for a reason," she continued, lowering her voice. "This isn't the first time one of them has made contact, but it is the first time in over 20 years. And your farm's sudden recovery hasn't gone unnoticed by satellite imaging." As if summoned by their conversation, the trilling sound came again, this time directly above them. Jackson looked up to see the eagle circling overhead, its wings seemingly healed, its silver patterns shimmering brilliantly in the morning light. The government teams froze, many reaching for equipment or weapons. "Hold positions!" Dr. Reynolds commanded sharply. "No aggressive movements!" The eagle descended gracefully, landing on the wooden fence post nearest Jackson. Its patterns shifted to create a display more dazzling than anything he'd seen yet, a complex sequence of geometries that pulsed with meaningful intention. "It's communicating," Dr. Reynolds whispered, her scientific detachment momentarily overcome by wonder. "Just like the records described." "What records?" Jackson demanded. "What exactly do you know about this creature?" Instead of answering, Dr. Reynolds turned to a younger man who had approached with a tablet. She studied the screen briefly, then looked at Jackson with newfound respect. "It's chosen you as an intermediary, just like the Shoshone Ranger in '86 and the Blackfoot Tracker in '72. She straightened her posture. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm authorized to bring you into a classified program, effective immediately. Your family, too. What you've stumbled upon is part of the government's longest-running wildlife secret, a species we've been calling Aquila stellaris, star eagles. The eagle's patterns intensified at the mention of the name, creating formations that resembled constellations across its wing feathers. They're not just intelligent, Dr. Reynolds continued, watching the patterns with practiced attention. They're environmentally restorative. Their presence can heal damaged ecosystems, which is precisely what's happening to your drought-stricken farm. Elaine had emerged from the house and now stood beside Jackson, her hand finding his. "We've noticed," she said simply. Dr. Reynolds nodded. "I'm sure you have, but what you don't know is that they're not native to this mountain range, not originally. The first documented interaction was in 1947, shortly after Roswell." The implications of her statement hung in the morning air. "Are you saying—" Jackson began, unable to complete the thought. "I'm not saying anything definitive about origins," Dr. Reynolds replied carefully. "Only that these beings have been interacting with specific humans for generations. They choose individuals with environmental stewardship capabilities, often at moments of ecological crisis." The eagle trilled again, this time directing its communication clearly toward Dr. Reynolds. The scientist's composure slipped momentarily as she watched the complex patterns forming. "It knows me," she whispered, "or at least it knows what I represent." One of the tactical team approached urgently. "Dr. Reynolds, satellite shows 3 more airborne signatures approaching from the north. ETA 4 minutes. Jackson exchanged glances with Elaine. "More eagles?" "It's family," Dr. Reynolds confirmed. "They travel in small groups. This one was likely a scout." She turned to face Jackson directly. "Mr. Caldwell, I need your cooperation now. What happens in the next hour will determine whether your farm becomes a government-controlled research facility or remains your property with protected status as a contact site." The sudden shift in tone wasn't lost on Jackson. "That sounds like I have a choice, but your people are already setting up a military-grade perimeter on my land." Dr. Reynolds' expression softened slightly. "Standard protocol for initial contact scenarios. It can be temporary if you cooperate." She extended a tablet with an official document displayed. "This is a special resource protection agreement. It grants your farm protected status and ecological restoration assistance in exchange for controlled research access and your family's participation as primary liaisons." Jackson scanned the document, his former government experience helping him decipher the bureaucratic language. "And if I refuse?" "Then we invoke the National Security Act and place this entire property under immediate federal control," she replied without hesitation. "These beings are a resource of incalculable scientific value, Mr. Caldwell. One way or another, we will secure this contact site." The eagle let out another trill, this time creating patterns that seemed deliberately directed at the document in Jackson's hands. The silver markings formed symbols that resembled signatures, approvals, check marks. "I think our friend is offering an opinion," Elaine murmured. Jackson studied the eagle's intelligent eyes. "Are you telling me to sign this?" The patterns shifted to form what appeared to be a farmhouse surrounded by fields of corn, then transformed to show the same farm with research equipment integrated harmoniously into the landscape. "Remarkable," breathed Dr. Reynolds. "It's showing preferred outcomes. This level of abstract communication is unprecedented." The distant sound of powerful wings announced the arrival of 3 more eagles, their silver patterns visible even from a distance as they circled above the farm. Their synchronized movements created a spectacle that drew gasps from everyone in the yard. In that moment, Jackson realized he was standing at the crossroads of something far greater than his family's financial trouble or even his farm's survival. This was about humanity's relationship with an intelligence we were only beginning to comprehend. "I'll sign," he said finally, "but I want amendments. My family maintains operational control of the farm. No permanent government personnel stationed on site without our approval, and we want full disclosure about everything you know about these beings." Dr. Reynolds considered this, then nodded. "The first two conditions are acceptable. The third will require security clearances, but can be arranged." She extended her hand. "Welcome to Project Starlight, Mr. Caldwell." As they shook hands, the eagle launched itself from the fence post, joining its companions in a spiraling flight pattern above the farm. Together, they began to emit harmonized trilling sounds that seemed to vibrate through the soil itself. "What are they doing?" Elaine asked, watching in wonder. A young scientist monitoring equipment nearby answered, "Soil analysis indicates rapidly increasing microbial activity spreading from the center field outward, moisture levels rising throughout the topsoil layer. They're accelerating the healing process your farm has already been experiencing." Dr. Reynolds watched the eagles with professional admiration. "They're showing us what they can do. It's not just a demonstration, it's a promise." Jackson stood with Elaine, watching as the morning sun illuminated the four eagles circling above their struggling farm. For the first time in years, he felt something he had almost forgotten, hope, not just for their land, but for a future filled with possibilities he could never have imagined. "I still have questions," he said to Dr. Reynolds. "A lot of them." "Of course you do," she replied. "And believe it or not, Mr. Caldwell, so do we. These beings have been interacting with humans for generations, but we've barely scratched the surface of understanding them. That's why contacts like this are so valuable." As the morning progressed, the government teams established a more cooperative presence. The initial tactical posture softened as equipment was set up to monitor and document the eagles' activities rather than contain them. Dr. Reynolds had clearly given orders prioritizing observation over intervention. Jackson's daughter Maya had emerged from the house, her initial fear transformed into fascination as she watched the technicians setting up sophisticated monitoring equipment. "Dad, what are those birds doing to our corn?" she asked, pointing to the central field where the eagles had concentrated their attention. Before Jackson could answer, one of the scientists called out in amazement, "The growth rate is accelerating exponentially. We're seeing cellular division at 300% normal speed." The withered corn stalks were visibly straightening, their color deepening from sickly yellow to vibrant green. The transformation was happening quickly enough to observe with the naked eye. "They're not just healing your farm," Dr. Reynolds explained, approaching with a tablet displaying real-time data. "They're optimizing it. Look at these soil readings. Microbial diversity, nutrient cycling, water retention, everything is being enhanced beyond normal agricultural parameters." Maya, who had been studying agricultural science before deferring college, examined the readings with growing excitement. "These nitrogen fixation rates shouldn't be possible without industrial fertilizers," she observed. "And the root systems are developing networks that look almost like neural pathways." Dr. Reynolds nodded approvingly at Maya's quick analysis. "Exactly. They're not just growing plants. They're creating intelligent agricultural systems. Self-regulating, drought-resistant, pest-repelling. We've documented similar effects at previous contact sites, but never this rapidly or at this scale." Jackson felt a surge of paternal pride at his daughter's quick grasp of the situation, followed by a sobering thought. "Previous contact sites, what happened to them?" Dr. Reynolds' expression became guarded. "That's part of the classified information we'll share once your clearances are processed. What I can tell you is that each contact served a specific ecological purpose. Once that purpose was fulfilled, the eagles moved on. So they won't stay permanently. Elaine concluded, joining the conversation. No, Dr. Reynolds confirmed, but their effects do. The ecosystems they restore remain enhanced for generations. There's a wildlife preserve in Montana that still shows elevated biodiversity 60 years after a contact event. The rangers there don't even know why their sector is special. As they spoke, the eagles completed their work on the central cornfield and moved to the eastern pasture where the drought had been particularly severe. Their synchronized movements resembled an aerial ballet, each bird covering a specific section with methodical precision. By mid-morning, a more senior government official arrived, a stern-looking man introduced only as Director Harlow from an agency Jackson had never heard of. The new arrival pulled Dr. Reynolds aside for an intense conversation, occasionally glancing at Jackson and his family with unconcealed interest. "I don't like the way that man is looking at us," Elaine murmured. "Government bureaucracy at work," Jackson replied quietly. "Someone higher up just realized they don't fully control the situation." Their observation proved accurate when Dr. Reynolds returned with Director Harlow, who immediately tried to assert authority. "Mr. Caldwell will need to evacuate your family temporarily while we establish proper containment protocols," he announced without preamble. "Standard procedure for a contact of this magnitude." Before Jackson could respond, the eagles reacted. All 4 birds immediately ceased their restoration work and circled directly above the gathering. Their trilling calls took on a sharper quality, and their patterns shifted to display what appeared to be warning signals, jagged, rapidly pulsing formations. Director Harlow looked up nervously. "What are they doing?" "Responding to your threat," Jackson said calmly. "They clearly understand English, or at least intent, and they don't seem to like the word containment." Dr. Reynolds stepped forward. "Sir, with respect, the agreement we just established with the Caldwell family specifies that they remain on site as primary liaisons. These beings have chosen them specifically." "That agreement hasn't been approved by Central Command," Harlow countered. The eagles descended lower, their patterns growing more intense. The farm equipment nearby began to vibrate subtly, and the air took on the charged quality that precedes a lightning strike. One of the technicians monitoring atmospheric conditions called out urgently, "Electromagnetic anomalies increasing," similar to the Montana incident of '72. Director Harlow's face paled at this information. He looked from the eagles to Jackson, clearly reassessing the situation. "The Montana incident resulted in the complete failure of all electronic equipment within a 3-mile radius," Dr. Reynolds explained quietly, "including military-grade shielded devices. It took 6 months to replace everything, and the eagles simply relocated to another contact site." The message was clear. Pushing too hard could result in losing the opportunity entirely. Harlow adjusted his approach immediately. "Perhaps we can discuss a compromise that maintains the Caldwell family's central role while ensuring proper security protocols." The eagles responded to this shift in tone. Their patterns calmed, returning to the more harmonious displays they had exhibited earlier. They resumed their restoration work, though one eagle remained vigilant, circling above the government teams. "I think we understand each other," Jackson said, extending his hand to Director Harlow. "We want to work with you. So do they, apparently. But this is still our home, and they chose us for a reason." Over the next several hours, a new framework was established. The farm would remain under Caldwell family control, with government research teams having designated access areas. In exchange, the family would receive immediate financial assistance to address their overdue loans and infrastructure needs, classified as ecological restoration funding. By mid-afternoon, the farm had been transformed into a hybrid operation, part working agricultural enterprise, part cutting-edge research facility. The initial military-style perimeter was replaced with more discreet monitoring systems, and most of the tactical teams were withdrawn in favor of scientific personnel. The eagles continued their work throughout the day, systematically addressing different sections of the farm with their restorative abilities. Wherever they focused their attention, withered crops straightened, soil darkened with renewed fertility, and even small wildlife began to return. Butterflies, bees, and birds that had abandoned the drought-stricken area months ago. Jackson found himself working alongside Dr. Reynolds, whose initial authoritarian approach had softened into genuine scientific enthusiasm. As they tracked the eagle's progress across the property, she began sharing information about previous contacts. The first documented interaction was with a Navajo shepherd in 1947, she explained, showing Jackson photographs on a secure tablet. The government initially thought they were dealing with something, not from Earth. And now, Jackson prompted, current theory suggests they're a highly evolved Earth species that developed along a different path than conventional avian evolution. Their ability to manipulate matter at the molecular level indicates they may have branched off from conventional evolution millions of years ago. Like a parallel development, Jackson mused, his scientific background helping him grasp the concept exactly. While humans were developing tools and technology, these beings were developing biological manipulation and communication skills beyond anything we've classified. They don't build tools, they transform environments directly. As evening approached, the eagles gathered at the farm's highest point, a small hill overlooking the entire property, their patterns synchronized in what appeared to be communication between themselves, occasionally punctuated by trilling calls that carried across the fields. Dr. Reynolds, Jackson, and Elaine observed from a respectful distance, joined by Maya, who had spent the day assisting the agricultural scientists. "What do you think they're discussing?" Maya wondered aloud. "Next steps, perhaps," Dr. Reynolds suggested. "They're methodical. Every contact site we've documented shows evidence of careful planning and execution. Nothing random." Jackson noticed something in her tone. "You admire them." The scientist allowed herself a small smile. "How could I not? They embody everything environmental conservation aims to achieve. Restoration without destruction, enhancement without exploitation. We spend billions trying to reverse ecological damage, and they accomplish it with biological processes we barely comprehend." As darkness fell over the farm, the eagles created their most spectacular display yet. Their silver patterns illuminated the hilltop with a complex tapestry of light that seemed to map the entire valley, highlighting watersheds, wildlife corridors, and ecological connections invisible to the human eye. "They're showing us the bigger picture," Elaine whispered, watching the display with wonder. "It's not just about our farm." Dr. Reynolds nodded, her eyes never leaving the illuminated patterns. "Every contact we've documented is part of a larger ecological restoration pattern, individual sites that, when viewed together over decades, form a comprehensive environmental rehabilitation network." "You mean they've been systematically healing the land?" Jackson asked, the implications slowly dawning on him. "One contact at a time for at least 70 years that we know of," Dr. Reynolds confirmed, "possibly much longer. Before the government began tracking them, there are Native American accounts of silver eagles bringing fertility to drought-stricken lands going back centuries. As they watched, the eagles' patterns shifted to show what appeared to be future projections, the restored farm connecting to neighboring properties, creating a green corridor that extended throughout the valley. The display seemed to accelerate, showing seasons passing, the restored land spreading outward year by year. "They're not just fixing the immediate problem," Maya realized. "They're starting a process that continues long after they're gone. Ecological momentum, one of the scientists murmured, furiously taking notes. They create self-sustaining restoration systems that continue expanding outward. As the night deepened, the eagles concluded their display and descended from the hilltop. To everyone's surprise, they approached Jackson and his family directly, landing in a semicircle before them. The largest eagle, the one Jackson had first discovered, stepped forward and created a pattern that seemed directed specifically at him. The pattern showed the farm transformed, lush, vibrant and productive, but with Jackson and his family central to the image, teaching others about what they had learned. "I think it's showing us our role," Elaine said softly. Dr. Reynolds had stepped back, giving the family this moment of direct communication. They always choose their human partners carefully, people with the capacity to understand and continue their work. The eagle created another pattern, this one showing neighboring farms experiencing similar transformations, with the Caldwell family serving as a connection point between the eagles and the wider human community. "They want us to be interpreters," Jackson realized, "to explain what they're doing to others." The eagle trilled softly in what seemed like confirmation, its intelligent eyes fixed on Jackson's. The connection between them was almost tangible. Not just farmer and wildlife, but two conscious beings reaching across the boundaries of species to find common purpose. For Jackson, who had once abandoned his wildlife biology career to save his family farm, the moment held profound meaning. He wasn't just saving his family's heritage anymore. He was part of something that could transform agriculture throughout the drought-stricken West. As the eagles took flight once more, disappearing into the night sky to continue whatever restoration they performed under darkness, Jackson stood, with his arm around Elaine and Maya, watching the silver patterns fade into the distance. "Remember when our biggest worry was making the bank payment?" Elaine said, echoing thoughts from what seemed like a lifetime ago, though it had been only days. Jackson nodded, feeling the weight of financial ruin lifted from his shoulders. Replaced by a new responsibility he was only beginning to understand. "Dad," Maya said thoughtfully, "if what Dr. Reynolds says is true, and these eagles have been doing this for generations, why haven't we heard about it? Why keep it secret?" Jackson glanced toward the government teams, still monitoring equipment around the farm, considering his answer carefully. "Human nature, I suppose. We tend to control what we don't understand, study what we can't control, and sometimes fear what we can't study. But maybe that's changing." Dr. Reynolds approached, having overheard the conversation. "Your daughter asks a good question. The program has remained classified for complex reasons, some legitimate, some less so. Fear of public panic, national security concerns, interagency rivalries." She looked up at the stars, where the eagles had disappeared. "But perhaps the time for secrecy has passed." "What do you mean?" Jackson asked. "These contacts have been increasing in frequency over the past decade, correlating precisely with climate change acceleration. 7 documented interactions in the last 3 years, compared to only 23 in the previous 60 years. She turned to face them directly. "I believe they're responding to ecological crisis, and they want to be discovered now." The implications of her statement hung in the night air. If these beings had remained hidden by choice, their increasing visibility represented a deliberate change in strategy. "They're not just healing the land," Elaine realized. "They're teaching us to heal it ourselves." Dr. Reynolds nodded. "That's becoming our working theory. Each contact site becomes a living laboratory, not just for ecological restoration, but for human education." As they stood under the star-filled Idaho sky, the transformed cornfield stretching before them, where barren dust had been just days earlier, Jackson felt a profound shift in his understanding of his place in the world. The farm that had been a burden threatening to break him with its demands and failures, had become something he could never have imagined. A bridge between species, a classroom for ecological wisdom, a beacon of hope in a time of environmental crisis. "So what happens tomorrow?" he asked quietly. "Tomorrow," Dr. Reynolds replied, "we begin learning everything they're willing to teach us. And I suspect that's quite a lot." Maya pointed to the darkness beyond their property line, where faint silver glimmers could be seen moving methodically across the neighboring ranch. "I think tomorrow's already started." 1 week after the government's arrival at Caldwell Heritage Farm, the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Fields that had been withered and brown now stood lush and vibrant, with corn stalks reaching toward the sky at unprecedented growth rates. The 4 eagles had established a systematic restoration pattern, working methodically across the property with purpose and precision that amazed even the most skeptical scientists. The farm had become a harmonious blend of working agricultural operation and cutting-edge research facility. Government teams had constructed a temporary field laboratory in what had been an unused equipment shed, filling it with technology that seemed decades ahead of anything publicly available. Yet, true to their agreement, they maintained a respectful distance from the family's daily operations, treating the Caldwells as essential partners rather than mere hosts. Jackson stood at the edge of his eastern field, now a verdant showcase of ecological restoration, watching as Maya led a small team of agricultural scientists through the corn rows. His daughter had blossomed in this new environment, her deferred college education replaced by hands-on learning that no university could have provided. The government scientists treated her as a colleague, valuing her innate understanding of the land and her rapidly developing insights into the eagle's methods. "Your daughter has quite a future ahead of her," remarked Dr. Reynolds, joining Jackson at the field's edge. "She's grasped concepts our researchers have been struggling with for years." Jackson nodded with quiet pride. "She's always had a connection to this land. Now, she's finding her purpose in protecting it." The senior scientist had become a daily presence at the farm, her initial authoritarian approach giving way to genuine collaboration as she witnessed the eagle's preference for partnership over control. Today, she carried a secure tablet displaying new data. "We've completed the analysis of the soil samples from the central field," she said, offering Jackson the tablet. "The results are, well, revolutionary would be an understatement." Jackson examined the figures, his scientific background helping him grasp the significance. "These carbon sequestration rates are impossible." "Were impossible," Dr. Reynolds corrected. "The eagles aren't just restoring your farm to its previous state. They're creating an enhanced ecosystem that actively combats climate change. The microbial communities they've established are capturing atmospheric carbon at rates we've only theorized in our most optimistic models." As they spoke, one of the eagles, the original one Jackson had found with the injured wing, now fully healed, circled above them before landing gracefully on a nearby irrigation pipe. Its silver patterns shifted in what had become a familiar greeting display. "Good morning to you too," Jackson said, having grown comfortable addressing the beings directly. The eagle tilted its head slightly in acknowledgement, then created a complex pattern that both humans had learned indicated important communication to follow. "It wants to show us something," Dr. Reynolds translated unnecessarily. They had all become familiar with the eagle's basic communication patterns. The eagle launched back into flight, circling once overhead in clear invitation before heading toward the western boundary of the property, the area the restoration effort had not yet reached. Jackson and Dr. Reynolds followed in an electric utility vehicle, joined by Elaine, who had spotted them from the farmhouse porch. As they approached the property line, they found all 4 eagles gathered in formation around what appeared to be A community meeting. 24 local farmers stood in a semicircle, their expressions ranging from skepticism to wonder as they witnessed the eagle's displays. Maya was already there, apparently serving as an interpreter of sorts between the creatures and her neighbors. "Dad!" she called as they arrived. "The eagles summoned everyone this morning. They've been showing the neighboring farms what's possible." Jackson recognized faces from throughout the valley, men and women whose families had farmed this region for generations, all now struggling with the same drought that had nearly destroyed his own operation. Among them stood Margaret Denton, the bank loan officer who had given him that final 30-day deadline that now seemed a lifetime ago. "Jackson," she greeted him with open amazement, "when you said you had a solution to your financial troubles, I never imagined." Her voice trailed off, as one of the eagles created a particularly spectacular pattern that seemed to map the entire watershed of the valley. "They're expanding their restoration efforts," Dr. Reynolds realized, watching the display with growing excitement. "They're showing a valley-wide rehabilitation plan." The eagle's patterns had evolved to incorporate agricultural imagery that the farmers could readily understand. Crop rotations, water conservation systems, soil management techniques, all integrated with the eagle's unique enhancement methods. They were offering a partnership, not just with the Caldwells, but with the entire agricultural community. One farmer, Harold Winters, whose family had been among the first settlers in the valley, stepped forward. "Jackson, your girl here says, these birds can save our farms like they saved yours. That true?" Before Jackson could answer, the lead eagle created a pattern showing Harold's distinctive red barn, surrounded by thriving fields, then expanded the image to include neighboring properties, all interconnected in a web of silvery light that represented the eagle's enhancement network. "They can do more than save our farms," Jackson replied, finding confidence in the eagle's display. "They can transform them into something better than they've ever been. But there's a condition." The farmers looked at him expectantly. "They're not here to do the work for us. They're here to teach us how to work with nature instead of fighting it. It's a partnership, not a rescue." Dr. Reynolds nodded approvingly, as Jackson continued, addressing his neighbors with the passion of someone who had glimpsed a greater truth. "For generations, we've been taught that farming means conquering the land, forcing it to produce what we want, when we want it, regardless of natural cycles. These beings are showing us there's another way, enhanced agriculture that works with natural systems instead of against them." The skepticism on some faces began to soften as the eagles created more detailed displays, showing specific techniques tailored to each farm's unique challenges. They weren't offering a one-size-fits-all solution, but a customized approach that honored each farmer's knowledge while introducing new possibilities. Margaret Denton, ever the practical financial mind, asked the question most were thinking, "What's the cost? There's always a cost." Jackson looked to Dr. Reynolds, who stepped forward to address the gathering. "The government is prepared to offer the same arrangement to participating farms that we've established with the Caldwells. Ecological restoration funding, technical support, and infrastructure improvements in exchange for your cooperation with research efforts." She paused, then added with unexpected candor, "I won't pretend there aren't strings attached. You'll be part of a classified program. There will be monitoring, data collection, and certain operational protocols to follow. But your farms remain yours. The eagles have made it clear they won't participate any other way." A murmur ran through the group as they processed this information. The eagles, seeming to sense the human hesitation, intensified their displays, showing before and after images of what appeared to be previous restoration sites from around the country, once devastated landscapes transformed into thriving ecosystems. "These are other places they've helped," Dr. Reynolds explained, "some dating back decades. The results speak for themselves." Harold Winters, who had been studying the eagles with narrowed eyes, suddenly laughed, a sound of surrender and wonder combined. "Hell, I was about to lose everything anyway," he said, gesturing toward his drought-stricken fields visible in the distance. 50 years of breaking my back on this land, and I was 2 months from foreclosure. If these fancy birds think they can fix what's broken, I'm willing to listen." One by one, the other farmers nodded their agreement, some cautiously, others with growing excitement as they recognized the unprecedented opportunity before them. The eagles responded with trilling calls that seemed to vibrate with approval, their patterns shifting to show what looked like celebration. "What happens now?" asked Sarah Begay, a young farmer who had taken over her family's struggling operation, just months before the drought hit. In answer, the lead eagle launched into flight, circling once before heading directly for Sarah's property, visible on the neighboring hillside. The other 3 eagles remained, continuing their displays for the gathered farmers. "Now," Jackson said, "they begin, and so do we." The meeting dispersed with a sense of cautious hope as farmers returned to their properties, many followed by government scientists eager to establish baseline measurements before the eagles' intervention began. Maya went with Sarah Begay, already explaining what they'd learned about the eagle's soil enhancement techniques. As the crowd thinned, Dr. Reynolds pulled Jackson and Elaine aside, her expression more serious than it had been in days. "There's something you should know," she said quietly. "The expansion to neighboring farms has accelerated the timeline. Director Harlow's superiors are taking notice. Higher-level officials will be arriving tomorrow." Jackson felt his stomach tighten. "What does that mean for our agreement?" "It should remain intact," she assured him. "But there will be pressure for more intensive research, more control over the eagle's activities. These beings have demonstrated capabilities beyond anything in our classified records. That attracts attention from people with different priorities than ecological restoration." "Military applications," Elaine concluded grimly. Dr. Reynolds neither confirmed nor denied this, but her silence was answer enough. "The eagles won't cooperate with that," Jackson said with certainty. "They've made their intentions clear. They're here to heal, not to provide technology or weapons." "I know that," Dr. Reynolds replied, "and you know that. But convincing people who haven't witnessed their work firsthand." She left the sentence unfinished, her concern evident. As if summoned by their conversation, the lead eagle returned, landing on the fence post beside them. Its patterns shifted to form what appeared to be a warning. Images of men in military uniforms, laboratories, containment facilities, followed by empty landscapes devoid of the eagle's presence. "They're monitoring our communications," Dr. Reynolds realized. "Of course they are." The eagle created another pattern, this one showing Jackson and his family standing between government officials and the eagles, mediators, protectors, interpreters. "I think they're asking for our help," Elaine said softly. Jackson studied the intelligent eyes of the creature before him, remembering the broken wing, the trust it had shown him from the beginning. A partnership went both ways. "Tell your superiors. This," he said firmly to Dr. Reynolds, "any attempt to militarize or weaponize what's happening here will result in the immediate departure of the eagles. We'll lose if that happens." The scientist nodded, her own allegiance clearly torn between her government role and the unprecedented ecological miracle she was witnessing. "I'll convey your message, but be prepared for pushback." The eagle's patterns shifted once more, showing a map of what appeared to be the entire western United States, with dozens of glowing points scattered across it. The implication was clear. This was not an isolated event, but part of a coordinated effort involving many more eagles than the 4 at their farm. "How many are there?" Jackson asked Dr. Reynolds. "We've documented approximately 30 individuals over the past 7 decades, she replied. "But the pattern suggests." "There are hundreds," Jackson concluded, studying the map. "Maybe thousands. And they're all doing what these four are doing here, healing the land, teaching the people who live on it. The eagle trilled in what seemed like confirmation, the map expanding to show connections between the glowing points, a network of restoration spreading across the continent. It's not just a program, Elaine whispered in realization. It's a movement. The implications of this revelation were still sinking in when they heard vehicles approaching, not the usual government SUVs, but heavy trucks. Looking toward the main road, they saw a convoy of agricultural vehicles turning onto the farm's entrance road. Tractors, irrigation equipment, seed drills, all brand new and gleaming in the afternoon sun. "What's this?" Jackson asked, turning to Dr. Reynolds. The scientist smiled, seemingly relieved by the change in subject. "Part of your ecological restoration funding package. State-of-the-art equipment designed to work with the enhanced agricultural methods the eagles are teaching. Your farm will be the demonstration center for the entire region." As the convoy approached, Jackson saw local drivers at the wheels. Men and women from the community who had lost work as farms failed during the drought. The lead tractor stopped, and a weathered man Jackson recognized as Frank Torres, a skilled mechanic who had been unemployed for months, climbed down with a grin. "They hired me to maintain all this fancy equipment," he announced, gesturing to the impressive array of machinery. "Said you're gonna need a whole team to keep up with what's coming." Jackson looked from the equipment to Dr. Reynolds. "This goes beyond our agreement." "Consider it insurance," she replied candidly. "The more successful and visible this project becomes as an agricultural and ecological initiative, the harder it will be for anyone to redirect it toward other purposes." The eagle seemed to approve, its patterns shifting to incorporate the new equipment into the vision of the farm's future. It created an image of the Caldwell farm as a hub of activity, farmers gathering to learn, scientists working alongside local agricultural workers, the eagles overseeing it all from above. As the equipment was unloaded and the drivers gathered to receive instructions, Jackson felt a profound sense of responsibility settling over him. In just over a week, his failing farm had become the center of something revolutionary, not just in terms of agricultural science, but in humanity's relationship with the natural world, and perhaps with intelligences we were only beginning to recognize. "We need to be ready for tomorrow," he told Elaine quietly. "If they're sending higher-level officials, they'll be looking for reasons to take more control." "Then we'll give them reasons not to," she replied with determination. "The eagles chose us, not them. There's wisdom in that choice we're only beginning to understand." As evening approached, the eagles gathered on the hillside overlooking the farm, their patterns synchronized in what had become their nightly conference. From this distance, their silver displays created a spectacle visible throughout the valley, a beacon of restoration and hope, in a region that had known only struggle and loss for too long. Farmers from neighboring properties had gathered along the roads to watch the display, many bringing their families to witness the phenomenon. News had spread throughout the community, despite the government's efforts at containment, and the mood was one of cautious celebration, as if a long-awaited rain had finally begun to fall after years of drought. Jackson and his family joined, Dr. Reynolds on their front porch, watching as the eagle's display grew more elaborate, incorporating what appeared to be stars and celestial movements into their patterns. "What are they showing?" Maya asked, recording the display on a tablet provided by the research team. "I think they're demonstrating connections," Dr. Reynolds replied thoughtfully, "between earth and sky, between soil and cosmos. Indigenous cultures have long understood these relationships, but our modern agriculture has forgotten them." The eagle's patterns shifted to show what appeared to be historical images, ancient farming practices, ritual celebrations of harvest, humans working in harmony with natural cycles. Then the images accelerated through time, showing the industrialization of agriculture, the increasing disconnection from natural systems, and finally the current crises of climate change and ecological collapse. They're showing us how we got here, Jackson realized, not to shame us, but to help us understand the path back. The final sequence of the eagle's display showed their vision of the future, not a return to primitive methods, but a synthesis of advanced understanding and natural wisdom. The images showed farms producing abundant food while simultaneously healing the land, communities gathering to share knowledge rather than competing for resources, and humans serving as caretakers rather than conquerors. "It's beautiful," Elaine whispered, her eyes reflecting the silvery light. "And it's possible. They're showing us it's actually possible." As darkness fell completely, the eagles concluded their display with a simple image that needed no interpretation. The Caldwell family standing alongside their neighbors, hands joined, surrounded by thriving fields and healthy ecosystems. A future worth building. The following morning brought the anticipated government delegation, 3 black helicopters landing in the eastern field that had been designated as a temporary helipad. Jackson stood with Dr. Reynolds and his family, watching as officials in suits and military uniforms emerged into the bright Idaho sunshine. "Remember," Dr. Reynolds murmured, "these people have only read reports. They haven't experienced what we have. They need to see success, not controversy." Jackson nodded, straightening his shoulders as he prepared to defend not just his farm, but the vision of the future the eagles had shared. The lead figure approaching from the helicopters was a stern-looking woman in her 60s, with short silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. She was flanked by military officers and aides carrying secure briefcases. "Undersecretary Helen Mercer," Dr. Reynolds whispered. "Department of Interior, my boss's boss's boss." "Mr. Caldwell," the woman greeted Jackson with a firm handshake. "I've read the reports about what's happening on your property. Quite extraordinary claims. I'm here to see firsthand whether they justify the resources being allocated." Her tone made it clear that she remained skeptical despite the documentation she had received. Jackson recognized the look. He had seen it often enough in farmers confronted with new methods. Show, don't tell, would be the only effective approach. "We appreciate your interest, Undersecretary," he replied. "Would you prefer a formal briefing first, or would you like to see the results immediately?" "Results speak louder than presentations, Mr. Caldwell." Jackson nodded, gesturing toward the utility vehicles lined up nearby. "Then let's show you what's been accomplished in just 8 days." As they prepared to depart, the distinctive trilling call of the eagles sounded overhead. All 4 birds appeared, circling the gathering with their silver patterns gleaming. In the morning light, several military officers reached instinctively for sidearms before restraining themselves. "Those are our partners," Jackson said pointedly, "not specimens or subjects. They understand everything we say and do." "Undersecretary," Mercer studied the eagles with undisguised fascination, "so I've been told. Though I must say, reading about intelligent birds with restoration capabilities is quite different from seeing them." The eagles descended, landing on fence posts surrounding the gathering. Their patterns shifted to create what had become their standard greeting display, but with additional elements that seemed specifically directed at the newcomers. "They're welcoming you," Meyer explained, stepping forward confidently, "but also establishing boundaries. They're showing that they're here by choice, not obligation." Mercer raised an eyebrow, impressed by the young woman's interpretation. "And you are?" "Maya Caldwell. I've been documenting their communication patterns and working with the agricultural implementation team." "She's been essential to our understanding of their methods," Dr. Reynolds added. "The eagles respond to her intuitive grasp of their intentions." The Undersecretary nodded thoughtfully, then turned to the assembled vehicles. Well then, let's see this miracle I've been hearing about. The tour that followed was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of everything the Eagles had accomplished. They visited fields in various stages of restoration, from the fully recovered central section to areas where work had just begun. Scientific teams presented data on soil composition, crop productivity, and carbon sequestration rates. Agricultural experts demonstrated the sustainable farming techniques being implemented. Throughout the tour, the Eagles accompanied them, occasionally creating displays that enhanced the scientists' explanations or corrected misinterpretations. Their active participation made it impossible to dismiss them as merely unusual animals. They were clearly intelligent collaborators in the project. By midday, even the skeptical military officers had fallen silent, overwhelmed by the evidence. Before them, fields that satellite imagery confirmed had been barren dust just days earlier now stood lush with growth. Soil tests showed microbial diversity and carbon levels that defied conventional understanding. The economic projections demonstrated agricultural yields far beyond anything previously achieved in the region, all while actively reversing climate impacts. It's not just about saving farms, Jackson explained as they stood at the property line overlooking neighboring lands where restoration had begun to spread. It's about reimagining our relationship with the land. These eagles aren't giving us a quick fix. They're teaching us a new way of working with natural systems. Undersecretary Mercer had remained largely silent throughout the tour, asking occasional pointed questions but revealing little of her thoughts. Now she turned to Dr. Reynolds. The security implications of these beings are significant, she said in a low voice. Their ability to manipulate biological systems at the molecular level has obvious applications beyond agriculture. Before Dr. Reynolds could respond, the lead eagle landed directly in front of Mercer, its intelligent eyes fixed on hers. It created a pattern more complex and specific than any they had witnessed before. Images of laboratories giving way to open fields, military installations transformed into restoration centers, weapons converted to plowshares. The message required no interpretation. The eagle then created another pattern, showing the four of them simply vanishing, followed by restoration sites across the country going dormant simultaneously. I believe they're responding to your implied question about military applications, Jackson said carefully. They're showing you their choice, collaboration on their terms, or withdrawal of their assistance entirely. Mercer studied the eagle with new respect. They understand the concept of leverage. They understand partnership, Elaine corrected gently. They're offering humanity something precious, not a technology to be exploited, but wisdom to be integrated. The Undersecretary considered this, then surprised them with a genuine smile. My background before government was in environmental law, Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell. I spent 20 years fighting for ecological protection against short-sighted exploitation. I know the difference between a quick technological fix and true systemic change. She turned to face the eagle directly. Your methods align with what our best scientists have been advocating for decades. The difference is, you can demonstrate results in days that our models projected would take generations. The eagle's patterns shifted to show what appeared to be acknowledgement, followed by a display of accelerating restoration spreading across landscapes. Time is a factor, Jackson translated, having grown adept at interpreting their communications. They're saying we don't have generations to gradually change course. The climate crisis requires immediate dramatic action. Mercer nodded, turning to her military aides. Gentlemen, I believe we need to reconceptualize this project entirely. This isn't a security issue to be contained. It's an ecological partnership to be expanded. She faced Dr. Reynolds directly. I want the research focus shifted, less emphasis on understanding what these beings are, more on implementing what they're teaching. Full agricultural and ecological integration should be our priority. The relief on Dr. Reynolds' face was evident. That aligns perfectly with the eagle's demonstrated preferences. What about the classified status? Jackson asked. The secrecy around all this? Mercer considered the question thoughtfully. Some level of protection remains necessary for the eagles as much as for our interests. But I agree the current approach is too restrictive. She gestured toward the gathered neighbors, watching from a respectful distance. These beings have chosen to work with communities, not just government agencies. Our role should be supportive, not controlling. As if in response to her words, the eagles launched into flight, creating a spectacular midday display visible throughout the valley. Their patterns showed restoration, spreading outward in concentric circles, farm by farm, community by community, region by region. I believe they're expressing agreement with your assessment, Maya said with a smile. Undersecretary Mercer watched the display with undisguised wonder. In 30 years of government service, I've never encountered anything like this. These beings aren't just restoring land, they're offering us a different future than the one we've been heading toward. She turned to Jackson and his family. The Caldwell farm will remain the center of this initiative, but with expanded scope and resources. We'll need demonstration sites throughout the drought-affected West, teaching centers where farmers can learn these methods. Your family's role as intermediaries will be formalized with appropriate compensation. Jackson exchanged glances with Elaine and Maya, seeing his own emotions reflected in their eyes. Relief, pride, and the weight of new responsibility. We didn't ask for this role, he said honestly, but we're willing to serve if it helps. Bridge the gap between these remarkable beings and the communities that need their wisdom. The eagles circled overhead, their patterns shifting to show what appeared to be approval of this arrangement. One broke from the formation, descending, to land once more before Undersecretary Mercer. It created a pattern showing government resources flowing to farms and communities, supporting the restoration work rather than controlling it. I understand, Mercer said directly to the eagle. Partnership, not appropriation. The eagle's response was to create its most beautiful pattern yet, a vision of restored landscapes, stretching across continents, vibrant with life and productivity. The display concluded with an image of eagles and humans working side by side, each bringing their unique gifts to the shared effort of healing Earth's damaged systems. As the eagle rejoined its companions in flight, Jackson felt a profound sense of witnessing a turning point, not just for his family's farm or even the drought-stricken region, but possibly for humanity's relationship with the natural world. The intelligence in the eagle's eyes, the purpose in their restoration work, the wisdom in their teaching methods, all suggested a kind of consciousness humans had failed to recognize in our fellow Earth species. Perhaps that recognition was as important as the ecological techniques they were sharing. We have a lot to learn, he said quietly to Undersecretary Mercer, as they watched the eagles soaring above the transformed landscape. And not just about sustainable agriculture. The government official nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, Mr. Caldwell, perhaps the most important lesson is the one we should have learned long ago. We are not the only intelligent species on this planet. We've just been very poor listeners. As the day's meetings concluded and plans were formalized for expanding the initiative, Jackson found a moment alone with the lead eagle. It had returned to the spot where he had first discovered it, the once barren corner of the cornfield that now stood lush with growth beyond anything the farm had ever produced. "Thank you," he said simply, knowing the being understood. "For choosing us, for not giving up on humans despite all our mistakes." The eagle's patterns shifted to create an image more personal than any it had shown before. Jackson, as a young wildlife biologist, filled with passion for protecting natural systems before the weight of family obligation had pulled him back to the farm. Then it showed his current self, standing at the center of a restored landscape, that original passion fulfilled in ways he could never have imagined. "You're saying this was always my path?" he asked, moved by the eagle's perception. The patterns shifted again, showing interconnected threads of choice and circumstance, human decisions and natural processes, all weaving together toward healing and renewal. Not predestination, Jackson realized, but possibility, the potential that exists when humans align their efforts with natural wisdom instead of working against it. As night fell over the transformed farm, the four eagles created their most spectacular display yet, a vision that illuminated the entire valley with silver light. Their patterns told a story of Earth's past, present, and possible future. Ecological collapse giving way to renewal, human ingenuity partnered with natural intelligence, a planet healing from centuries of damage. Standing with his family and neighbors, watching the eagle's message of hope spreading across the night sky, Jackson felt something he had not experienced since childhood. A sense of being exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The farm that had been a burden, threatening to break him with its demands and failures, had become something he could never have imagined, a beacon of hope, a center of learning, a bridge between species. "Do you think they'll stay?" Maya asked softly, watching the eagles with wonder. "Not forever," Jackson replied, remembering Dr. Reynolds' explanation of previous contacts. "But long enough to teach us what we need to know. Long enough to help us start something that can continue without them." "That's their gift," Elaine added, her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "Not dependency, but empowerment. They're showing us how to be better stewards of our own home." As the eagles concluded their display and settled into the trees for the night, Jackson looked out over his transformed land, then to the neighboring farms where restoration was already spreading. The drought that had threatened to destroy generations of agricultural heritage had instead become the catalyst for an entirely new approach, one that worked with nature's wisdom rather than against it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Government protocols to navigate, skeptical farmers to convince, technologies to adapt. But for the first time in years, the future held more promise than threat. The eagles had not just healed his land, they had restored his sense of purpose. In the silver light of the stars, the Caldwell Heritage Farm had become a place of new beginnings, not just for one farming family, but potentially for humanity's relationship with the living earth. 1 month after the initial discovery of the silver eagle, Caldwell Heritage Farm had become the epicenter of an agricultural revolution that was spreading across the drought-stricken West. What had begun as one farmer's desperate attempt to save an injured bird had catalyzed a transformation that few could have imagined possible. The morning sun crested over the Teton range, illuminating a landscape reborn. Fields that had been barren dust now stood lush with crops growing at accelerated rates. Irrigation canals that had run dry for seasons flowed with crystal-clear water whose origins baffled conventional science. The very air seemed different, cleaner, more vibrant, charged with a subtle energy that visitors noticed the moment they crossed onto restored land. Jackson Caldwell stood on the newly constructed observation platform at the farm's highest point, surveying the valley spread before him. Dozens of neighboring properties now showed the distinctive patterns of eagle restoration, concentric, circles of vibrant growth radiating outward from where the beings had begun their work. From this vantage point, the valley resembled a living patchwork quilt of renewal, each farm a testament to the partnership that had defied skepticism and bureaucratic resistance. "Quite a view, isn't it?" remarked Dr. Reynolds, joining him on the platform. In the weeks since their initial confrontation, The government scientist had become not just a colleague, but a friend. Her dedication to the Eagle's mission earning the respect of the entire Caldwell family. "Sometimes I still can't believe it," Jackson admitted. "A month ago I was facing foreclosure. Now—" He gestured toward the thriving landscape. Dr. Reynolds smiled, the early light softening her normally businesslike demeanor. "Now, you're at the forefront of what may be the most significant ecological breakthrough in human history." This wasn't hyperbole. The data gathered from the restored farms had upended multiple fields of scientific understanding simultaneously. Soil science, agricultural technology, climate remediation, interspecies communication, all had been revolutionized by what the Eagles were teaching. Most remarkably, the Eagles had begun training select humans in their restoration techniques. It had started with Maya, whose natural affinity for the beings had deepened into a form of apprenticeship. Under their guidance, she had developed the ability to perceive energy flows in soil and plant systems that conventional instruments couldn't detect. Other young people with similar sensitivities had been drawn to the farm, forming what the media had dubbed the Eagle Corps, students of a new ecological discipline that blended cutting-edge science with ancient wisdom. "The conference delegations start arriving today," Dr. Reynolds reminded him, checking her tablet. "Representatives from 27 countries, not counting the UN Environmental Program team." Jackson nodded, straightening his shoulders slightly. The upcoming International Sustainable Agriculture Summit had been relocated from Geneva to Idaho on remarkably short notice, after Undersecretary Mercer had shown key global leaders satellite imagery of the transformation. What had been planned as a typical policy conference had evolved into something more akin to a pilgrimage. Agriculture ministers, climate scientists, and indigenous knowledge keepers all converging to witness firsthand what many still considered impossible. "Are the Eagles ready?" he asked, knowing how carefully the beings managed their interactions with humans. They had been very selective about public appearances, seemingly aware of the delicate balance between inspiring change and creating dependency. "They've prepared quite a demonstration," Dr. Reynolds confirmed. "The patterns they showed during last night's communication session suggest they understand the historical significance of this gathering." As they spoke, Elaine approached with a group of visitors, farmers from California's Central Valley, another region devastated by prolonged drought. Their weathered faces showed the familiar progression from skepticism to wonder as they took in the verdant fields stretching in every direction. "This was all dead land 4 weeks ago," one woman asked, her voice holding the caution of someone afraid to hope too completely. "Completely barren," Elaine confirmed. "Our corn yield had dropped to less than 15% of normal. Now, we're projecting 300% of our best historical harvest, with higher nutritional content and without chemical fertilizers. And using 80% less water," added Maya, who had joined the group carrying soil sampling equipment. At 22, she had transformed from a hesitant student into a confident educator, her expertise sought by agricultural scientists with decades more formal education. The California farmers exchanged glances, the desperate hope in their eyes, reflecting regions where water conflicts had grown increasingly bitter as wells ran dry and allocations shrank. They represented the front lines of climate change's impact on American agriculture, precisely the people the Eagles seemed most determined to reach. "You'll meet them this afternoon," Jackson assured the group. "They've been working with our team to develop specific adaptations for your growing conditions and water challenges." The visitors followed Elaine and Maya toward the demonstration fields, their initial reservation giving way to eager questions. Jackson watched them go, still marveling at how completely the Eagles had upended conventional wisdom about what was possible. "Director Harlow wants a word before the main conference," Dr. Reynolds said quietly, nodding toward a black SUV pulling up to the visitor center. The security protocols for tomorrow's classified session are being finalized. Jackson suppressed a sigh. The public-facing summit was only part of the week's agenda. A parallel set of closed-door sessions would address the more sensitive implications of the Eagle's presence, including aspects that remained strictly classified. While the agricultural and environmental applications had been carefully positioned as the central story, the government hadn't overlooked the profound implications of contact with an intelligent non-human species capable of manipulating matter at the molecular level. The potential national security dimensions remained a source of tension between the Eagle's demonstrated priorities and certain governmental interests. "I'll meet him at the main house," Jackson replied. "Just make sure he understands. The Eagles set the boundaries for those discussions, not us." "He's well aware," Dr. Reynolds said with a faint smile. "After that demonstration last week, when they shut down our satellite coverage for precisely 4 minutes, the intelligence community has developed a healthy respect for their preferences." As Jackson made his way toward the farmhouse, now retrofitted as an administrative center, he passed several research stations where scientists worked side by side with local farmers, integrating traditional agricultural knowledge with the Eagle's innovative techniques. This collaborative approach had been Maya's suggestion, honoring generations of farming wisdom rather than discarding it in favor of the new methods. The results spoke for themselves. Farms that had implemented this synthesis of approaches showed even better outcomes than those relying solely on the Eagle's intervention. The beings seemed to approve of this integration, often directing their most detailed teachings toward farmers who maintained deep connection to their land's history. Inside the farmhouse, the atmosphere buzzed with purposeful activity. What had once been a simple kitchen now served as an impromptu situation room, with screens displaying data from restoration sites across 3 states. The living room had become a briefing center where teams of agricultural extension officers received training before returning to their home regions as instructors. Director Harlow waited in what had been Jackson's office, now expanded to accommodate meetings with officials from agencies whose acronyms were rarely spoken aloud. The man's initial antagonism had evolved into grudging partnership as the Eagles consistently demonstrated that cooperation yielded better results than attempts at control. "Caldwell," he greeted Jackson with a brisk handshake. "We have some developments to discuss before the summit begins." Jackson noticed immediately that the director hadn't come alone. A woman in civilian clothing sat quietly in the corner, her bearing suggesting military background despite her neutral pantsuit. "This is Dr. Amara Chen, Department of Defense Liaison to the Xenobiological Assessment Task Force," Harlow introduced, her with obvious discomfort. "She has clearance to discuss all aspects of Project Starlight." Jackson kept his expression neutral, though internally he bristled at the xenobiological terminology. The Eagles had shown every indication of being terrestrial in origin, despite the initial Roswell connection that Dr. Reynolds had mentioned during their first encounter. The military's insistence on framing them as potentially extraterrestrial felt deliberate, a bureaucratic maneuver to justify greater Pentagon involvement. "Welcome to Caldwell Heritage Farm, Dr. Chen," he said, choosing courtesy over confrontation. "What can I help you with today?" The woman studied him with analytical precision before speaking. "Mr. Caldwell, I'll be direct. Tomorrow's classified briefing will include senior military and intelligence officials who have questions about defensive applications of the Eagle's restoration technology." "The Eagles don't have technology in the way you're thinking," Jackson corrected her. "They don't build devices or create weapons. They work directly with living systems, which is precisely what makes their capabilities so significant," she countered smoothly. "Molecular manipulation without mechanical intervention. represents a paradigm shift in multiple domains, including defense. Jackson exchanged glances with Director Harlow, who seemed uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "The Eagles have been extremely clear about their priorities," Jackson said carefully. "They're here to restore damaged ecosystems and teach sustainable agricultural practices. They've shown no interest in military applications." Perhaps they haven't been asked the right questions," Dr. Chen suggested, "or by the right people." Before Jackson could respond, the distinctive trilling call of an eagle sounded directly outside the window. All three humans turned to see one of the silver beings perched on the windowsill, its patterns shifting in what Jackson had come to recognize as its equivalent of a frown. Dr. Chen's eyes widened slightly, her first show of genuine emotion. "Is it listening to us?" "They're always listening," Jackson confirmed, "and watching and understanding far more than most people realize." The eagle's patterns shifted to create an unmistakable display, military hardware transforming into farming equipment, weapons becoming tools for cultivation rather than destruction. "I believe they're responding to your inquiry about defense applications," Jackson translated unnecessarily. "They've consistently shown that their interest lies in creation, not destruction." The eagle created another pattern, this one showing humans applying its techniques to heal rather than harm, restore rather than damage. "They're not being naive or idealistic," Jackson continued, interpreting the display. "They understand conflict exists, but they're offering us solutions to the resource scarcity and environmental degradation that drive many conflicts in the first place." Dr. Chen studied the eagle with undisguised fascination. "The report said they were intelligent, but this level of abstract communication, it's extraordinary." The eagle trilled softly, its patterns shifting to show what appeared to be military installations surrounded by restored landscapes, not eliminating defense infrastructure, but integrating it into healthier environments. "I think they're suggesting a different approach to security," Jackson said. "One based on abundance rather than scarcity, cooperation rather than competition." Director Harlow cleared his throat. "Dr. Chen, I believe this directly addresses the questions your superiors plan to raise tomorrow. Perhaps you should report this interaction." The woman nodded slowly, her analytical facade softening slightly as she continued to watch the eagle's displays. "Yes, I think that would be appropriate, though I suspect they'll want to see this firsthand. They'll have their opportunity," Jackson assured her. "The Eagles have agreed to a full demonstration for the classified session, but they'll set the agenda, not us." As if confirming his words, the eagle created a final pattern showing concentric circles expanding outward, its consistent metaphor for how its wisdom should spread, from person to person, community to community rather, than being confined within institutional hierarchies. After Dr. Chen departed to report to her superiors, Director Harlow lingered, watching through the window as the eagle launched into flight, joining its companions circling above the farm. "You know, Caldwell," he said reflectively, "when I first arrived here, I was convinced this was a national security issue to be contained. Now I'm starting to think it's a solution to be embraced." Jackson nodded, appreciating the man's candor. "That's the journey most people make after spending time with them. They don't just restore land, they restore perspective." As midday approached, vehicles began arriving for the afternoon's public demonstration. Local and national media had set up a forest of cameras and broadcast equipment on the specially constructed viewing platforms. Agricultural officials from drought-affected states throughout the West mingled with international representatives, all eager to witness the eagles in action. The Caldwell family had worked with Dr. Reynolds' team to develop a presentation format that balanced scientific explanation with the eagle's direct demonstration. Maya would lead the technical briefing on soil enhancement techniques. Elaine would cover water conservation methods, and Jackson would facilitate the eagle's interaction with the gathering. As the audience settled into place, a tension of anticipation hung in the air. Many had seen the satellite imagery and data, but actually witnessing the eagle's work firsthand was an experience no report could capture. Jackson stepped to the microphone, surveying the gathered dignitaries, scientists and farmers, an unlikely assembly united by desperate need and cautious hope. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, the amplified words carrying across the restored fields, "1 month ago I stood in this exact spot, facing financial ruin. Our wells were running dry, our crops were failing, and generations of family farming tradition seemed destined to end in bankruptcy and foreclosure." He paused, letting the stark reality of that recent past settle over the audience. "Today, as you can see, the situation has changed dramatically. But what you're witnessing isn't simply a farm that recovered from drought. What you're seeing is the beginning of an entirely new relationship between humanity and the natural world." On cue, the 4 eagles appeared from different directions, converging above the demonstration field in a spiraling formation that drew gasps from the audience. Their silver patterns caught the midday sun, creating prismatic reflections that danced across the gathering. "These remarkable beings chose our farm as a contact point," Jackson continued, "but their vision extends far beyond one property or even one region. They're offering humanity a new model of agriculture, one that heals the land rather than depleting it, that creates abundance through cooperation with natural systems rather than conquest of them." The eagles descended to perch on specially constructed platforms, their patterns shifting in synchronized displays that even those seeing them for the first time could recognize as deliberate communication. Maya stepped forward, activating the large display screens that showed magnified soil samples and real-time data feeds from the monitoring equipment. "What you're about to witness is not magic or science fiction," she assured the audience, her confidence belying her youth. "It's biology operating at levels we're only beginning to understand. The eagles work with living systems that already exist in the soil, optimizing and enhancing natural processes rather than replacing them." At an unspoken signal, the eagles launched into flight again, circling the demonstration field, an area intentionally left unrestored for this purpose. As they flew, their trilling calls harmonized in complex patterns that seemed to vibrate. Through the ground itself, the effect was visible almost immediately. The dry, cracked soil began to darken with moisture drawn from deep underground. Dormant microorganisms reactivated in explosive growth visible on the magnified displays. Seeds that had lain dormant through years of drought suddenly germinated, pushing green shoots toward the sun with visible speed. The audience watched in stunned silence as an accelerated version of the restoration process unfolded before them. Within 30 minutes, what had been barren ground was sprouting with diverse vegetation. Soil sensors registered unprecedented increases in organic matter, microbial activity, and water retention capacity. Elaine stepped to the microphone next, directing attention to the hydrological displays. "Notice the moisture patterns," she instructed. "The eagles aren't creating water from nothing. They're restoring the natural water cycle that drought disrupted. They're re-establishing the microbial networks that help soil retain moisture, rebuilding fungal systems that transport water efficiently, and repairing the damage that industrial agriculture often inflicts on natural hydrology." As the demonstration continued, the eagles expanded their focus to include the audience itself. They descended to hover just above the gathering, their patterns shifting to create distinctive displays for different groups. Agricultural imagery for the farmers, technical data for the scientists, economic projections for the government officials. They're tailoring their communication to each viewer, Jackson explained. They understand we have different concerns and different languages for discussing the same fundamental issues. The lead eagle, the one Jackson had first discovered with the injured wing, created a spectacular display showing drought maps of the western United States gradually transforming from red zones of severe water scarcity to blue regions of hydrological health. The timeline indicated decades of transformation compressed into years through the eagle's intervention. "They're showing us what's possible," Jackson translated, "not a quick fix, but an accelerated healing process that works with natural cycles, rather than against them." As the demonstration concluded, the eagles circled one final time before landing directly in front of the assembled dignitaries. Their patterns shifted to create a unified message, human hands joining with eagle wings, surrounding a globe where deserts bloomed and barren lands returned to life. The meaning required no interpretation. The spontaneous applause that erupted from the audience, including hardened skeptics and cautious bureaucrats, spoke to the visceral impact of witnessing possibilities that challenged everything they had believed about ecological limits. As the formal presentation transitioned to a question-and-answer session, Jackson found himself approached by an elderly man he recognized from news coverage, the agriculture minister from a North African nation facing catastrophic desertification. "Mr. Caldwell," the dignitary said with quiet intensity, "my country loses thousands of acres of farmland to the desert each year. Millions face food insecurity as a result. Would these beings consider bringing their healing to other continents?" Before Jackson could respond, the lead eagle landed beside them, its patterns shifting to create an unmistakable map of North Africa, with restoration patterns spreading across the Sahel region. "I believe that's your answer," Jackson said with a smile. "They go where the need is greatest and where there are humans willing to learn their methods. From what they've shown us, their work here is just the beginning." The minister's eyes filled with tears as he watched the eagle's detailed display of his homeland transformed. "We have ancient traditions of living in harmony with difficult lands," he said softly. "Perhaps it is time to remember this wisdom and combine it with what your eagles can teach." The eagle trilled in what sounded remarkably like approval, its patterns shifting to show traditional agricultural methods integrated with its enhancement techniques, precisely the approach that had proven most successful at Caldwell Farm. Throughout the afternoon, similar interactions unfolded as representatives from drought-affected regions across the globe sought direct communication with the eagles. Each time, the beings responded with customized displays showing potential restoration pathways specific to that region's challenges and cultural context. By evening, as the official program concluded and guests departed for their accommodations, in nearby towns, the atmosphere had transformed from cautious interest to electric excitement. Plans were already being formulated, commitments made, partnerships established between regions that had previously seen each other only as competitors for dwindling resources. Jackson stood with his family on the observation platform, watching the sunset paint the restored valley in golden light. Dr. Reynolds joined them, her tablet finally set aside after a day of continuous documentation. The UN Environmental Director is calling it the most significant breakthrough in sustainable agriculture of the century, she reported. 7 countries have already requested formal restoration partnerships. "How many can the eagles actually help?" Elaine asked practically. "There are only 4 of them here." Dr. Reynolds smiled mysteriously. "That's something they've asked to demonstrate tomorrow. Apparently, we've only seen the beginning of their capabilities." Maya, who had been quietly observing the eagles circling in their evening flight patterns, suddenly pointed toward the eastern horizon. "Look!" Against the darkening sky, silver points of light were visible, dozens of them approaching in a formation that mirrored the 4 eagles they had come to know. Their distinctive trilling calls carried across the valley, answered by their companions already present. They called for reinforcements, Jackson realized, watching in awe as more silver eagles appeared from every direction, converging above. The farm, in a spectacle that seemed to blend the northern lights with a precision air show. Not reinforcements, Dr. Reynolds corrected softly. Family, community. They're showing us that they never work alone, just as they don't want us to work alone. As night fully descended, the assembled eagles, now numbering well over 50, created their most spectacular display yet. Their combined patterns illuminated the entire valley with silver light, showing interconnected restoration sites spanning continents, a global network of healing spreading outward from points of initial contact. The message was unmistakable. What had begun with one injured eagle on a failing farm was merely the first thread in a tapestry that could eventually encompass the world. The beings weren't offering a localized solution, but a planetary one. If humanity was willing to learn, to adapt, to partner rather than exploit. The gathered eagles concluded their display with a final vision. Earth seen from space, transformed from a planet of expanding deserts and shrinking forests to one, where vibrant ecosystems flourished even in regions long abandoned to desolation. The story that began with a farmer finding an injured eagle continues to unfold across our world, reminding us that when we approach our challenges with openness and humility, miracles can happen in the most unexpected ways. The government vehicles that had once surrounded the Caldwell farm in a show of control had been transformed into something entirely different. Carriers of a message of hope, transporting scientists and farmers who would take the eagle's teachings to other struggling regions. What had begun as a classified government intervention had become a global movement for ecological restoration. And it all started with one simple act of compassion, a farmer choosing to help an injured eagle rather than ignore its suffering. Sometimes the smallest decisions create the widest ripples, and sometimes the most profound revolutions begin not with grand declarations, but with quiet acts of care. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.